Tonight on Primetime, Israel deepens its military operations against Hezbollah inside Lebanon as clashes intensify and ceasefire efforts struggle to hold. We will wipe them out completely, vows Netanyahu. Good evening. The Israeli military is intensifying operations in Lebanon after a rise in Hezbollah drone attacks, while Israeli authorities say they killed the new leader of Hamas's armed wing in Gaza despite a fragile ceasefire. Blake Sifton reports now for A News.
The Israeli military says they have carried out 150 strikes against Hezbollah targets in southern and eastern Lebanon. On Tuesday, health authorities in Lebanon say that dozens of people were killed in those attacks. Now, all of this follows a call by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the military to intensify their operations in Lebanon and for soldiers to push further into the country and, in his words, intensify the blows against Hezbollah. Now, all of that follows what's been a major strategic shift on the ground in southern Lebanon in recent weeks, where Israeli forces are stationed some 10 kilometers into Lebanese territory. Hezbollah is increasingly using the kind of small first-person view suicide drones that have transformed the battlefield in Ukraine. They're using these small drones to target Israeli soldiers stationed in Lebanon. They are posting many videos every day of these drones striking soldiers as well as Israeli military vehicles. And these drones are attached to a thin fiber optic cable, which means that they are immune from jamming, and the Israeli military has so far not had an answer to combat them. Hezbollah is also increasingly using these drones on Israeli border communities. Now, in ordering the military to advance further into Lebanon, analysts believe that the military and the government are trying to push Hezbollah further north out of range of using these drones with the fiber optic cables. Now, under pressure from the United States, the Israeli military has mostly avoided striking Beirut and eastern Lebanon in these daily airstrikes that they have been carrying out since a very shaky ceasefire came into effect last month. But with this intensification of operations, there are concerns that they may now begin carrying out strikes in more sensitive areas. And of course, we need to remember that Iran has included an end to Israeli attacks against Hezbollah as a major demand of theirs in negotiations with the United States. So these intensifying operations could jeopardize those talks. Now, meanwhile, the Israeli government and military says that they have killed on Tuesday night the new leader of Hamas's military wing in Gaza. That follows the killing of his predecessor only 11 days before. A ceasefire was agreed, of course, in Gaza in October, but some 900 Palestinians have been killed since in various strikes and shootings by Israeli forces. President Trump's Gaza peace plan has stalled in its second phase as the war in Iran has distracted attention, with many stakeholders distracted and, of course, under attack themselves in that war. Blake Sifton for A News in Tel Aviv.
Well, the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, as we've heard, appears to be entering a more dangerous phase, with military operations expanding on the ground and diplomatic efforts failing to gain traction. Joining us now to unpack the latest developments is John Kavalik, senior editor at Issue Insight, joining us from Istanbul. John, always good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us on Primetime tonight. Ramping up then, as Mr. Netanyahu has said. How significant is this latest expansion of Israeli operations inside Lebanon?
For Israel, it's not significant at all. You know, from their perspective, any territory that's south of the Litani River, meaning generally within striking distance of Israel settlements, the Israel border, is basically theirs, and it's theirs to control, whether it in name only. So while we all look at the carnage that the Israeli Defense Forces has inflicted upon Gaza, inflicting upon Lebanon, inflicting upon Iran from different perspective. The reality is Israel is going to keep going, because when Prime Minister Netanyahu talks about his enemies, or we're gonna go as long as it takes, and whatever we need to do, the one recurring theme is they always find new enemies, which means they always keep going. And so there's never an end to it, because there's always going to be someone that Prime Minister Netanyahu or Minister Smitrovich or any of them can say, he's a Jew hater. He's an anti-Semite. He wants to use a drone. Hasn't used one yet, but he wants to use a drone. Oh, there are children. Well, we killed their parents. They're going to grow up and they're going to want to use drones. So we're going to have to keep those, we're going to have to push them out as well. Basically, Israel's looking at southern Lebanon almost as Gaza. It's a garbage dump. And they're just trying to get rid of everyone that they can.
And John, when you look at the language of Israel's descriptions of who they're targeting, how they're targeting, they say that they're targeting Hezbollah infrastructure and improving security in the north. Now, it's possible to interpret that as both broad and vague, but also being sort of reasonably targeted. It's sort of ambiguous, I guess, in that sense. How is Hezbollah likely to be interpreting this?
Hezbollah is looking at it, this is a survivalist moment. But for them, they've had a survivalist moment, for decades. But since October 7th of 2023, more focused. But every morning they wake up knowing that it's likely the Israeli Defense Forces know where they are, and it's simply a matter of time before Israel tries to go after them. What helps them in terms of the survivability question is how many civilians are around us. And what they're counting on, what Hezbollah counts on, what Hamas counts upon, what almost all countries count upon, is that civilians will somehow be a break, will be a block on retaliation or action, kinetic or otherwise. But in Israel case, we've seen this in Gaza. They put very, very low value on human life that isn't Israeli. And that means if you're Muslim, that means if you're Palestinian, that means if you're Lebanese, you are a legitimate target no matter what you really do. And so Hezbollah and Hamas, they know that. And unfortunately, that means that civilians will keep dying because this is the type of military landscape that exists.
And John, you touched on this idea, this perception of ownership. Now, reports suggest Israeli forces may have moved beyond previous demarcation lines. How important could that be strategically?
You look at Syria, you look at the Golan Heights, and Israel occupied it. The United Nations and EU and everyone says they should have given it back a long time ago, but they should certainly have begun the process of giving it back when Mr. Assad was overthrown. But what was the Israeli response? Whoa, now with Mr. Assad gone, our mortal enemy, we have a new government, therefore they're unknown, so we're going to have to take more territory of Syria. And they initially said, well, we're only going to be here for a while, but then they said basically, we're going to be here permanently because we need a buffer for the buffer. And that's basically the landscape for Lebanon, that it's, we need a buffer, but then we need a buffer for the buffer. And because technology keeps getting, as your lead-in report talked about, that the drones that are being used now are fly-by-wire. I mean, they're connected. So that brings a whole new dynamic into the battlefield. And so Israel is just going to keep saying, we need more buffer for buffer for buffer. And that means you get to the river. And I wouldn't be surprised at some point that Israel says, maybe we should be north of the river, because the river potentially can be used. And so maybe we need to grab that too. And of course, it'll be temporary, which, we see how how Prime Minister Netanyahu and his team define temporary.
Yeah, very interesting indeed, John. So, I mean, are they just going to keep going? Is it possible to persuade them otherwise? Or is the strategy just to keep going until someone stops them?
You mean in terms of someone stops them being someone stops Israel?
Mm.
Yeah. Probably, which means it's unlikely to stop, because the Trump administration isn't really willing to say to Prime Minister Netanyahu, stop, and we mean it this time. There's always well, we want you to do this, want you to do that. They do it for a while, and then they go back to doing what they want to do. Our voice, the United States government's voice in Israel, is Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador, who is a Christian fundamentalist, a conservative. He's the one that not too long ago said, well, Israel should really control the whole thing. It really belongs to them in biblical terms. So we've got that kind of messaging from the ambassador is the official representative of the president of the United States. So we've got him running around saying that. We've got the cabinet of Israel, which is just rabid. And so for them, a conflict is sometimes not a bad thing politically. Netanyahu has elections coming up, which he has to, I believe he has to call by the end of October. And then that gets into another dynamic, which is the United States have the midterm elections at the beginning of November in terms of the House and the Senate. Normally the political party in power in the White House loses control of one or both. And so you've got this election potentially coming up, and what's Prime Minister Netanyahu going to do? Is he going to want to keep this going to then so that he's got everyone's attention diverted? Is he going to want to settle something so he can say, look, I'm the peacemaker, so elect me again? There's all these unknowns. But if you've got to default to anything with Israel, it's fight first, negotiate later.
Okay, John, so hard stroke impossible to stop Israel from prosecuting its strategy. How then do we stop Hezbollah? How is Hezbollah defeated? Because I suppose Israel would argue that you can criticize their methods, their tactics, their strategy, but they have a legitimate case in going after Hezbollah.
And that is one of those other challenges. Israel's right about that. Hezbollah has made a mess of Lebanon, and the Lebanese government has made a mess of itself. And Lebanon has been, sandwiched in between what was Syria before the civil war, during the civil war, after the civil war, issues relating to with Israel, and endemic corruption, and so it's they're in such a weak place. And whenever they try to, push Hezbollah out, Hezbollah sort of comes back in. And I think that's going to be the biggest problem is, does the community, meaning does the United States, does the European Union, does the Arab League as a group, do they come together and say, working with Iran, Hezbollah has got to stop. They've got to, whether disarm, whatever they do, but they're making it just, Lebanon has to be some sort of a successful state, as opposed to just in perpetuity being like a little dinghy on the ocean where it's tipping port to starboard. They keep bailing it out. It never sinks, but it just keeps tipping. So it's just unstable. Mm-hmm. So Israel's got a point, which is, Lebanon, these people are in your territory. It's your responsibility to stop them. And Lebanon will say, well, they're getting the support from Iran and from others, so it's hard, and you keep firing on civilians, which makes it hard. You keep blowing up our infrastructure. So you're shrinking our country, giving our people less place to go to be safe, sort of like Gaza. You keep shrinking Gaza, and then you blame it all on us. So there's just that proverbial blame game, and I think it leaves this unsettled, and it leaves Hezbollah wondering what the Iran-U.S. Israel agreement's going to look like, because that, the language is, well, that's included. Well, what does that mean? And what kind of time frame? And if this is another 12 or 14 point document like the Gaza peace plan, your reporter mentioned, 900 Palestinians dead since the peace plan was implemented. So I just don't see this unwinding in any short-term, meaningful way. And then, like I said, the big watch is by the end of October, Israel has to call elections. And what Prime Minister Netanyahu believes is good for him may not, and probably likely isn't good for people in Gaza and for people in Lebanon.
John, always good to get your analysis. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, after the break, fresh US strikes near the Strait of Hormuz put the fragile ceasefire with Iran under renewed pressure. Don't go away. A warm welcome back wherever you're watching Primetime. The fragile ceasefire between Iran and the United States is facing renewed pressure after fresh American strikes near the Strait of Hormuz. Well, Washington says the operation was defensive. Tehran is calling it a violation of the truce.
Iran has accused the United States of committing what it called a gross violation of the truce with the new strikes it launched on the country. The strikes were confirmed by US Central Command, which said American forces targeted Iranian missile sites and boats allegedly preparing to place mines in the Strait of Hormuz. The US described the operation as a self-defense strike aimed at protecting its troops and securing the vital shipping route. Iran's foreign ministry strongly condemned the attacks, calling them aggressive and unjustified. Tehran warned that it would respond to what it described as hostile actions and said the United States would be responsible for the consequences. The strikes reportedly took place near Bandar Abbas, home to a major Iranian naval base along the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important oil transit routes. Iran's blockade of the waterway has already pushed global energy prices higher. Iranian state media said explosions were heard in the area, while the Revolutionary Guard later claimed it had shot down a US drone and fired at an American fighter jet that entered Iranian airspace. Meanwhile, Iran's supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, issued a strong warning in a message carried by Iranian media during the Day of Arafah, part of the annual Hajj pilgrimage. Khamenei said Middle Eastern nations and territories would no longer serve as shields for US military bases. He added that the hands of time will not turn back, signaling what he described as a new regional order taking shape. The developments come during ongoing negotiations aimed at extending the ceasefire reached on April 8th after weeks of deadly conflict. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says a deal is still possible within days. But President Donald Trump has signaled caution, telling negotiators not to rush the talks.
Well, the ceasefire between Washington and Tehran was already fragile, but the latest military exchange near the Strait of Hormuz is raising new questions about whether diplomacy can still survive. Well, joining us now to discuss the latest developments is Gustavo de Aristegui, former diplomat who's joining us from Seville in Spain. Ambassador, always good to see you. Thank you for joining us tonight on Prime Time. So the US then say this is defensive, but how dangerous are these strikes for the broader ceasefire process?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show, and welcome from St. Paul University in Seville. You're absolutely right. I mean, we have been living what could be described without any kind of doubt as some kind of a Scottish shower, right? Warm, cold, warm, cold. We have been expecting breakthroughs in the peace negotiations between Iran and the United States, and then things go back to square one. But maybe it's not as positive as they say, and it's probably not as negative as they say. You're showing a very interesting footage of what is really happening or has been happening in the Strait of Hormuz since April 7th. The Americans have not been able to explain to the world that they had a very aggressive tactic that was actually cleaning the Strait of Hormuz of hostile vessels, the speedboats from Iran that were calculated to be around 2,000, and today is in the hundreds. Precisely because they combined strategies that had never been used in naval warfare. And that is precisely what happened. They used the A-10 Warthog aircraft, which is an anti-tank jet. And they used the infantry support attack helicopter, the Apache. And they had been extremely effective in cleaning the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of the hostile vessels that the Iranians had sent. So actually, the risk to commercial vessels had diminished greatly before April 7th. And only the primes in maritime insurance and the threats that have been issued by the Iranian regime have kept the majority of the traffic of oil and gas from going through the Strait of Hormuz. So let us just simply very quickly say that the conditions of the Americans to reach some kind of peace agreement are severely affected by what I call the paradox of the beheading. The paradox of the beheading is that the hierarchy of the regime that was eliminated on February 28th was capable of ideologically imposing on all the factions of the regime whatever concession or cession they needed to make to the Americans or to the Israelis to achieve peace. Today, everybody that has some kind of responsibility in the regime that heads some of the sectors or are main important generals in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, these are people that will never try to show their peers that they are in any way ceding, weak, or not as revolutionary, orthodox, or intensively engaged with the ideology of the revolution. So we are actually in a deadlock. If there is no prominent figure that will emerge from the ashes of the regime and will be able to impose itself from a standpoint of ideological authority on the rest of the factors or sectors of the regime, I'm afraid that we are going to be facing some kind of stalemate for the days to come. In any case, we do know one thing for sure, and that the Iranians are facing a horrible economic situation. We know now that it's not just 2.5 million jobs that have been lost. We're more in the neighborhood of 4.5 million jobs. That is catalyzed by the fact that there has been a blackout, an internet blackout that is completely killing the industry and the tradesmen and the bazaar, which is very important in Iran. And of course, the economic implosion is very much a reality today.
Against that backdrop then, are we in danger of making too much out of these recent strikes by the US? I mean, the narratives are completely opposed, aren't they? One side calling them defensive, the other side calling it a truce violation. But does it really matter?
I think that you have a very good point there. Actually, this has happened many times before. Whenever, let us recall recently, just some days back, that a speedboat attacked U.S. Navy boats, and that those missiles were successfully intercepted, or the fact that, for example, we know now that during the war before April 7th, other nations of the Gulf had taken advantage of the chaos reigning in the region to stage attacks against their enemies. For example, the Saudi Arabians attacked the bases of the pro-Iranian Iraqi militias, or the Emiratis that actually attacked the objectives within the Iranian territory itself. So right now, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that this is just the skirmishes that are preceding some kind of agreement, and that I really think that we should be very, very cautious in trying to see derailment in these attacks.
Now, you brought to life the realities of the situation inside Iran. At the same time, though, Iran's leadership is increasingly speaking about a new regional order. What message is Tehran trying to send both domestically and internationally?
It is a very interesting situation, you see, because what the Iranians are trying to convey to the region is that in the moment of their worst military and economic situation, in the moment of their highest point of weakness, they're trying to take advantage and to show their neighbors that they are actually going to take over something that they did not legally or operationally control. That is the Strait of Hormuz. What I am really shocked with is the unbelievable position of the Omani Sultanate that has criticized the West very harshly and very specifically the United States, and has thrown itself in the arms of the Iranians. And right now, that is a very bad sign, because, of course, the Strait of Hormuz has two sides. One is Iranian, and the other side is Omani. The tip of the Arabian Peninsula belongs to, it is under Omani sovereignty and not under the sovereignty of the United Arab Emirates. So this is a very important thing to put into the equation. But this said, right now, I truly believe that the Iranians are playing more of a bluff game in poker than really having the necessary cards to win the hand.
And what's behind that? It's a very interesting point you made, the sort of Omani acquiescence almost. What's driving that? Is that a desire to ensure that peace inside Oman happens, they avoid being attacked? Or is there something deeper, more cultural at play, do you think?
But something in between. I believe that the Omanis have lost all legitimacy as mediators. They presented themselves at the beginning of the conflict as the main mediators. That is no longer the case. We know, and that is not a bad thing, that the Omanis have held very close and very tight relations with Iran, even before the Islamic Revolution. It is only normal. I mean, we're talking about a very large country that is very near their neighbor, and culturally and commercially, they have been bound by centuries of trade and cultural exchange. And let us not forget that you have a very large community of Shia minorities in different parts of the Gulf that are largely overlooked, and many people erroneously think that they are pro-Iranian. Absolutely not. Most of them are perfectly integrated into their societies, especially in Kuwait or in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia or in the Emirates. Not so much, of course, in Bahrain. It is a completely different ballgame out there, but we do not have time to go into that. But as you were saying, the attitude of the Omanis is more of a strategical mistake in my point of view. I think that if the great Sultan Qaboos were alive today, he would not at all validate this position of his country.
Very interesting indeed. Finally, Ambassador, despite all of this, the US says a deal is possible within days. At the same time, President Trump says he's not satisfied yet on the details of the deal with Iran. I mean, to put it frankly, what is going to happen over the coming week?
Let us start with what everybody is saying, in my opinion, mistakenly, right? Too many analysts are saying that if we reach some kind of agreement with the Iranians today, it is to achieve something that was not in question before the war. That is the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. That is completely wrong. This is just one thing, and it's the most visible one, because it is the most needed one for world economies, peace, stability, prices, whatever you want, even energy security if you want. The other three conditions of the 15 or 19 or whichever number of conditions that you want to put on a paper, or the memoranda of understanding, how many, no matter how many may have been put forward, there are three conditions that are still standing. And those are the bases, the clear bases of peace right now and will be forever. First, stop supporting, financing, using, and impulsing your terrorist proxies in the region, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the terrorist militias, the pro-Iranian terrorist militias of Iraq. Stop your program of development of mid and long-range ballistic missiles, especially those that are supersonic and hypersonic. And third, and not less importantly, stop enriching uranium beyond 6%. And we know for a fact, because it is the United Nations Agency for Atomic Energy that has said so, they have found very clear evidence of enrichment of uranium at levels that surpass 83.7%. And we know for a fact that there is at least 1,000 pounds of enriched material that has been enriched in the centrifuges of Iran beyond 60%. So all these three conditions, plus the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, are the basis of peace. They accept this, there will be peace. They don't, there will not be peace.
Ambassador, always great to have your analysis on Primetime. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure.
Okay, after the break, we'll take a look at the top business news stories shaping the day with Andy Mioch. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Time for Business Now with Andy Mioch, who has joined us in the studio. Andy, what have you got on your agenda tonight?
Well, Guy, oil prices have declined amid conflicting reports of a possible peace deal draft between the U.S. and Iran. Another chip maker from South Korea has joined the $1 trillion club, and NASA has unveiled its plans for a moon base. So without further ado, first up, oil prices have dropped after Iranian state TV said that under a draft peace deal with the U.S., Tehran was committed to restoring transit through the Strait of Hormuz to pre-war levels within 1 month. The White House has, however, dismissed the report about an interim deal, calling it a complete fabrication.
Brent crude oil futures dropped more than 3% to below $97 per barrel on Wednesday, hovering near a 5-week low as optimism grew that the US and Iran could reach a peace agreement, despite conflicting signals from both sides. Iranian state television reported an unofficial draft of an interim deal to end the war, while the White House dismissed the report as a complete fabrication. A potential reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which normally carries about 20% of global oil and LNG supplies, could significantly ease pressure on global energy markets. However, major issues remain unresolved, including Iran's frozen assets and guarantees over shipping access through the strait. Iranian officials said indirect talks with Washington are continuing, while US Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned that any agreement may still take several days. The strait remains largely closed, although 2 non-Iranian supertankers crossed Hormuz on Tuesday for the first time in a week.
South Korea has become the first country other than the U.S. to have more than one company reach a $1 trillion market valuation. Chipmaker SK Hynix's new record value boosted the country's benchmark stock index, which also hit an all-time high.
South Korea's benchmark Kospi stock index hit an all-time high on Wednesday as SK Hynix topped $1 trillion in market value for the first time, joining its memory chip rivals Samsung Electronics and Micron Technology in reaching the milestone on an AI-driven rally. The Kospi rose 5% to 8,457 points, its highest on record. Shares of SK Hynix jumped as much as 14.9%, taking the South Korean chipmaker's market value to a record $1.1 trillion. Strong demand for high-end memory chips used in AI chipsets, like those designed by NVIDIA, has tightened supply and driven up prices, benefiting the world's biggest makers of semiconductors. Samsung Electronics surpassed $1 trillion in market value for the first time on May 6th, while US-listed Micron Technology did so on Tuesday, May 26th. There are only 3 Asian companies that have joined the $1 trillion club, including TSMC. South Korea has become the first country other than the US to have more than one company reach that market value.
Still with South Korea and chips, unionized workers at Samsung Electronics have approved a highly contentious bonus pay deal, one that averts a massive 18-day strike, but also exacerbates deep disparities in fortunes among workers at the tech conglomerate.
Samsung Electronics unionized workers in South Korea voted to approve a tentative wage deal, the union said on Wednesday, averting a strike that threatened to rattle global chip supplies and damage the South Korean economy. Nearly 74% of some 62,000 workers who cast ballots backed the deal, the union said. The approval came after a bitter 5-month dispute over performance bonuses tied to the company's booming AI chip business that has created a deep division among workers at the tech conglomerate. Labour and management had initially reached a tentative agreement last Wednesday, following last-minute mediation by South Korea's Labour Minister, just hours before unionised workers were scheduled to walk off the job. But a minority union representing the giant's consumer electronics workers said on Tuesday it has asked a South Korean court to block a vote on a pay deal that primarily benefits their colleagues in the company's chip divisions. Under the terms of the ratified agreement, Samsung will implement a new 10-year special performance bonus system for its semiconductor division, alongside an average 6.2% wage hike.
Staying with chip makers, NVIDIA is expanding heavily in Taiwan with a new campus and a tenfold increase in annual spending, according to its CEO, Jensen Huang. He said NVIDIA will start building a new office complex in northern Taipei, set to open in 2030.
NVIDIA's chief executive said on Wednesday the chip company plans to invest around $150 billion a year in Taiwan, terming it the epicenter of the AI revolution and predicting it will be the world's tech manufacturing hub for a long time. At a launch celebration in Taipei for the $5 trillion chipmaker's planned Taiwan headquarters, CEO Jensen Huang said the project will break ground this year and aims to be operational in 2030. He did not provide a time frame for the number of years the company plans to invest $150 billion. The Taiwan headquarters will bring NVIDIA closer to TSMC, the world's largest contract chipmaker, which makes many of the advanced semiconductors powering the trend towards AI and is a major supplier to the US tech giant.
Now for some aviation industry news. American Airlines is reportedly planning to double the number of staff in its India hub. It comes after a rival carrier announced similar plans.
US carrier American Airlines Group plans to double headcount at its India technology hub to about 800 by early next year. 2 people familiar with the matter told Reuters. Rival Southwest Airlines last week announced plans to expand its Hyderabad Global Capability Center to about 1,000 employees over the next few years. American Airlines set up its Hyderabad hub in 2024 and employs about 400 staff focused on software engineering, AI and cybersecurity, the sources said. The airline said it intends to continue hiring, but did not share specific details on the headcount, saying only that the hub has several hundred employees and forms part of its global technology network alongside US teams.
And finally, in lunar news, NASA is ordering landers, rovers, and drones for a sprawling moon base. The space agency outlined the first phase of its plans, awarding hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts.
NASA's latest plans for a series of privately funded lunar missions were announced on Tuesday, all leading to the plan of establishing a sustainable presence on the moon. Administrator Jared Isaacman said the Blue Origin Mark I Endurance lander will deliver multiple payloads to the Shackleton connecting ridge at the lunar South Pole. According to NASA, Phase 1 will begin with a rapid series of robotic missions to scout the region, test technologies, and prepare for surface operations. Carlos Garcia Galan, Program Executive for Moonbase, said Astrolab and Lunar Outpost were awarded contracts for the Lunar Terrain Vehicles, or LTVs. Phase 2 is expected by 2029, when NASA will begin to build semi-permanent infrastructure, and Phase 3 will aim to achieve a sustained presence, with routine crew rotations and continuous surface activity.
And on that extraterrestrial note, that's it for business for tonight. Handing it back to you, Guy.
Andy, whatever puns we select, over the moon, skyrocketing results, nevertheless, it's good news for the industry. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, after the break, Britain and Poland sign a major new defence treaty as Europe faces mounting security concerns linked to Russia and the war in Ukraine. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. Ukraine is pushing Europe to take a bigger role in peace efforts as US-led diplomacy struggles to gain momentum. Well, the appeal comes amid renewed Russian strikes and growing concern in European capitals over the direction of the war.
Ukraine is calling on the European Union to take a more active role in ending the war with Russia ahead of an informal meeting of EU foreign ministers in Cyprus. Kiev is seeking what it calls new dynamics in the negotiation process, with Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha pushing for a new format of talks involving greater European participation as US-led mediation efforts stall and Russia escalates its military campaign. The EU is reportedly considering renewed engagement with Moscow, even as Russian forces continue heavy strikes across Ukraine, which Kiev and its allies say have killed civilians and damaged critical infrastructure. Earlier, Russian officials, meanwhile, have warned of further systematic strikes on Kiev, urging foreign diplomats and citizens to leave the capital. The Kremlin says the attacks are in response to Ukrainian drone operations, while Ukraine rejects responsibility and calls the threats blackmail. At the United Nations, Ukraine's envoy Andriy Melnik accused Russia of intensifying attacks on civilians and infrastructure and called for a full ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian forces.
On the night of May 23 to May 24, Russian armed forces launched one of the largest combined attacks against Ukraine, employing hundreds of aerial weapons, including ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as unmanned aerial vehicles. For the city of Kiev, this was one of the most devastating attacks recorded to date.
The escalation has drawn international concern. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres told the Security Council he is deeply concerned by Russia's plan for expanded strikes in Ukraine, warning that further escalation could prolong civilian suffering and delay peace. European countries, including Germany, the Netherlands and Norway, have summoned Russian envoys in protest, while EU officials have condemned Moscow's warnings to diplomats as an unacceptable escalation and urged an immediate ceasefire. Russia has defended its actions, saying it is targeting military-linked facilities and rejecting Western criticism, while insisting its campaign will continue.
Well, Britain and Poland are strengthening defence ties as European countries face growing security concerns linked to Russia, cyber threats and the war in Ukraine.
Britain and Poland have signed a new defence and security treaty aimed at strengthening military cooperation and responding to growing security threats across Europe. The agreement was signed in London by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk during talks focused on defence and regional security. The signing ceremony took place at the Battle of Britain bunker, the underground command centre used by the Royal Air Force during World War II. The venue was chosen because of the role Polish pilots played in the Battle of Britain. Ahead of the ceremony, Tusk said the agreement will be known as the No-Salt Treaty, named after the nearby RAF base from which Polish pilots flew during the war. According to the British government, the treaty will deepen cooperation on defence, cybersecurity and border security, while also increasing coordination against organised crime and hostile state activity. The agreement includes plans for Britain and Poland to jointly develop advanced weapons systems, including a next-generation medium-range air defense missile. The two countries will also hold large-scale joint military exercises focused on counter-drone warfare and electronic warfare. British officials say the treaty comes amid growing hybrid threats across Europe, including cyber attacks, espionage and sabotage operations allegedly linked to Russia. Speaking ahead of the signing, Starmer described the agreement as the biggest step forward in British-Polish defence relations in a generation. Tusk called it a historic moment and said strong alliances are necessary to deter what he described as the Russian threat. Zena Ferizadeh, Air News, Manchester, United Kingdom.
Well, European governments are accelerating defence cooperation as concerns grow over Russia, hybrid threats and the future direction of the war in Ukraine. Joining us now to discuss the significance of these latest developments is Andriy Ordonovich, retired colonel from the Armed Forces of Ukraine, who's joining us from Kyiv in Ukraine. Colonel, very good indeed to see you. Thank you for joining us again on Primetime. What do you make then of this British-Polish defence treaty, and how significant is it in the broader security landscape of Europe?
I believe this kind of pact, bilateral one, is very timely and useful for entire European security. First and foremost, I believe it's accounted the raising foreign policy of Russia and trying to tackle their aggressiveness. Second one, it is also giving possibility to help Ukraine based on lessons learned and lessons identified during the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Thirdly, it's based on bilateral level. It is additional inputs toward the better, more efficient stance of NATO on the eastern flank. And fourthly, not lastly, it is improvement of defense industrial base cooperation in the most critical fields like air defense, like drones, counter-drones technology. And the idea probably staying behind to have appropriate numbers of different type of ammunition and armaments on stockpiles in order to be prepared for the possible Russian aggression. Because in both those countries, the Russia aggression against Ukraine and the foreign policy of Russia are treated as a main serious threat to their security and defense, not only for them, but also for NATO. And this example, I believe it will help to build better deterrence and defense within NATO because NATO would like on the time being to take more European responsibility rather than American, including of Canada.
Yes.
These developments are very much positive, and it's gonna have a positive development even in current, I believe, situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, the agreement itself focuses heavily on cyber threats, drones, hybrid warfare. Does this reflect, do you think, how Europe now sees just the very nature of modern conflict?
As you know, probably this war, full-scale invasion of Russia, not started immediately by the political decision of the Russian leadership. They started initially to explore possibility on cyber attack. They've been also apply some hybrid operation, including in UK, in London, when we are talking about the some action against Skripal, the former KGB officer, as well as hybrid operation on the Czech Republic, hybrid operation in Poland, using different type of the drones which penetrated into the Polish airspace. Those actions and operation, it is not a full-scale invasion or war, but it is already action which we could describe as a hybrid warfare against Russia, against the EU, NATO, and individual nation of those organizations.
And Ukraine's calling for a greater European role in peace efforts more generally. Does this mean that Kyiv is losing confidence in US-led diplomacy?
Since the beginning of US involvement in this kind of diplomatical efforts, Ukrainian political leadership was looking for more strong stance of European nation. And you remembered the couple of visits to Washington, D.C. was done with Ukrainians by numbers of European leaders. It was visible since the beginning that Ukraine is looking for more sophisticated, more comprehensive involvement of European nation. And eventually, when the politically US trying to take a pause for the negotiation, it is wisely to involve more Europeans. And historically and politically, Ukraine is a part of entire European continent. There is numbers of geographical scientists could mention it. On Ukrainian territory, we do have geographical center of Europe. It is a normal situation when Europeans are going to play more sophisticated or more complex role in negotiation process. And another effort what you do and could affect on the diplomatical efforts, it is a willingness to create the coalition of willing or coalition of ready nation who would like to help. And this coalition is awoken and started to do preparation of sound planning document, what kind of action could be applied when situation will allow. But numbers of Ukrainians are very much eager to see the European military on the Ukrainian soil to help and foremost to present a much stronger strategic deterrence against Russian invasion.
Now, Colonel, Russia's warnings to diplomats and threats of further strikes have triggered strong reactions in Europe, as we've been discussing. How seriously are European capitals taking this escalation?
For my understanding, they have taken very much seriously. Even the representative of EU in Ukraine, immediately after the signaling, the coercive signaling, and explained that it is not appropriate. And no one from European nation, as well as from EU Commission in Ukraine, from diplomatical corps, are not going to leave the country. Because Russian use old practice, old playbook, when they've been planned to do this full-scale invasion. On diplomatical level, I believe they inform some nations to take diplomatic personnel from Ukraine. It was by mistake, I believe, it done it because it's opened the full-scale invasion to Russia. But right now, the course of action in Ukraine and current military situation on battlefield are not telling for the number of nations to leave Ukraine. And I did not notice anyone, as for today and yesterday, that been moving out of Kyiv, moving to West or other kind of places. They still staying with Ukrainians. It's good sign. It gives us the kind of psychological positive development. But Russian use any possibility and the threat for the psychological pressure on numbers of European nations as well as their political military leadership.
Well, another recent development is that Russian media have announced that Putin is ready, apparently, for talks with Europe. I mean, what do you make of this?
I believe it is exactly when I can tell that positive development on the battlefield from Ukrainian side are creating appropriate diplomatic condition for the diplomatical efforts. And probably Russian calculated their current status when we've been talking previously that irreversible casualties, one example, since January up to the April-May months, roughly 200 casualties Russian paid for the 1 square kilometers of so-called occupation. But for the April and May, Ukrainians liberated more temporary occupied territory than they have lost. It is one signal for Russia to start to be more serious and allow Europeans to step forward. Second, based on the EU decision to cut off completely with the gas and oil supply from Russia to the middle and end of 2027, it is another kind of signal because they could not replace their war efforts, give more financial and other material resources towards this war of aggression, because Chinese are not gonna replace completely. And some economical sanctions are affecting, and this kind of a little bit losing economical sanction for the oil which are somewhere sinking on the ocean and different seas, are not allowing to replace completely status quo for the Russian economy with it. Plus, our long strike capability are growing, and we are reducing the economic fit of Russia from the oil and gas. It also have positive effect for the recalculation of Russian efforts toward the war of aggression in Ukraine.
So do you think then that we're going to now start to see a much more independent European security architecture emerging?
I believe it in current geopolitical environment, it is a demand from the security situation. I believe it with NATO based on different political solution of the American government to withdraw or to add some personnel into European continent. European nation should play more solid role in taking some responsibility from our friends from American continent for our security, because NATO was serving for a while, almost 80 years, for the security and defense of nation, to keep a peace and stability and prosperity. Everybody enjoy it. And Europeans on this context has to take a more solid responsibility. And I believe it, again, coming to the UK and Poland Defense and Security Pact, it could play exactly role what our US partner is looking for, and could be very much helpful to develop other regional alliances with NATO. But NATO, as a most successful geopolitical military political alliance should be existed for another centuries in order to keep security and peace. Hopefully, eventually will come to Ukraine, and Ukraine will join NATO as one of the members of this organization, or at least to be active partner based on Finland and Swedish examples in the last century, and eventually they join it. It's been NATO should be, has to be playing their role, but the bilateral, trilateral, and other regional engagement could help to sustain peace.
Colonel, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Kyiv. We appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, after the break, the World Health Organization steps up its Ebola response in the Democratic Republic of Congo as violence and limited access hamper efforts to contain the outbreak. Don't go away. Welcome back to Primetime. Good to have you with us this evening. The resurgence of Ebola in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo has placed renewed focus on hygiene practices in Bukavu. Local artisans and traders say demand for hand-washing stations has risen sharply, with the equipment increasingly used in both homes and public spaces. Health experts, however, stress that while hygiene is essential, it is not sufficient on its own to contain the spread of Ebola.
The resurgence of Ebola in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo has increased demand for locally made hand-washing stations in Bukavu. Local producers say orders from NGOs, businesses and residents have risen significantly since the latest outbreak began. In welding workshops across the city, artisans are building metal frames, fitting taps onto plastic containers and producing hand-washing units for markets, schools, homes and public spaces. The rise in demand comes as the World Health Organization reported more than 900 suspected Ebola cases and over 170 deaths in Congo and Uganda. According to health authorities, the outbreak involves the rare Bundibugyo strain, which currently has no approved vaccine and has spread from Ituri province into North and South Kivu, including Bukavu.
There's a basin, a metal stand, and a small basin connected to a tap. We're making these to help protect people against Ebola. Everyone should have one to wash their hands. Every time you leave the toilet or come home, you wash your hands. That's what these hand-washing stations are for. We were already selling them for household hygiene. Then the Ebola disease appeared at the time, and that continued before it ended. Then the coronavirus arrived, and we have continued like this until today. The set, including the iron stand, the basin, the small basin, and the tap, we sell for $13.
Doctors in Bukavu have welcomed improved hygiene practices, but say hand washing alone is not enough to stop the spread of Ebola.
In Bukavu, hand washing alone is not enough. We also need to raise awareness and educate the population and the community, because in addition to hand washing, we also have the use of hand sanitizer and social distancing. As you can see, there are several measures. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge we have here in Bukavu is the close proximity of people in public transport, at the market and everywhere else.
In Bukavu's markets, residents are using hand-washing stations, while health authorities continue to urge the public to follow preventive measures.
Now, the World Health Organization is stepping up its response in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with its chief visiting affected areas as health teams warn that violence and poor access are hampering operations. Well, the UN says the WHO chief is travelling to the Democratic Republic of Congo as the Ebola outbreak worsens, with more than 900 suspected cases and 220 suspected deaths reported. Health teams are providing essential services, but violence and poor access continue to slow the response. Well, the Ebola outbreak in eastern Congo is now raising alarm well beyond the region itself, with the World Health Organization warning that violence, displacement and limited access are seriously undermining containment efforts. Well, joining us now is Torun Govind, pharmacist and health commentator from London in the UK. Torun, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Primetime tonight. WHO officials then are warning that the outbreak is spreading faster than response efforts can contain it. At the same time, as often happens, we've got all sorts of commentators popping up online with slightly different perspectives saying, well, you know, this is a virus that's got a high mortality rate, but it doesn't spread easily. What's the reality of the situation on the ground?
Okay, so we know that the outbreak is outpacing efforts to contain it. And one of the big challenges in this area is the conflict in the area, the infrastructure, as you heard there. You know, there are efforts to increase washing facilities, but there's also limited access for medical teams. Now, this is a virus that is severe, it's deadly. They did take some time to identify the strain, which is always a difficulty when these viruses emerge. But one of the challenges here is it does spread via direct contact with infected bodily fluids. So it's a challenge for healthcare workers who are also working to stop the spread as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting this. You often get various points of view, don't you, online. People say, oh, well, the WHO are just exaggerating the fears and things. But as we all know, it's always best to consult the experts when things like this happen. One of the biggest concerns appears to be that this particular strain of Ebola, for which there's no approved vaccine, how much more complicated does the fact that there's no vaccine make the response?
Pose a challenge, and obviously, as I say, it took some time to identify this strain because test kits were initially looking for different strains, which contributed to when this took time to confirm. Now, a lot of the care is centered around supportive care because there isn't a vaccine for this at the moment. So that consists of IV fluids, electrolyte replacements. It's very much supportive hospital-led care. And also, we need to consider that the World Health Organization are quoting up to 9 months for a vaccine to be ready. We saw that this is not the same as COVID, but it does take time for a vaccine to be produced. And in this situation, Ebola is known to us. So, but creating vaccines, it's not an easy task and definitely one that poses an additional challenge.
Yeah, and not an easy task as well when you consider all the other things that you've mentioned that authorities are having to deal with: violence, attacks on treatment centres, reportedly disrupting operations in Eastern Congo. How difficult is it to manage a public health emergency in an active conflict zone?
Managing any public health emergency really relies on working with the population in that area. We also know there's distrust in that area of healthcare workers and also general sources as well, sources that, you know, here in the UK, we might be less concerned with acting on their advice. There is restricted humanitarian access due to the violence there. And those attacks on health facilities, you've quite rightly outlined. What I would just say here at this point is the people who are most likely to catch this are those who are caring for the infected. So healthcare workers, people who are preparing bodies for burials, and those who are in close contact with those who are symptomatic. It's such a difficult place for healthcare workers to be working in. There's overcrowded camps, mass displacement of people, and again, weak infrastructure when it comes to testing, surveillance and contact tracing, which is a really big part of the armour when it comes to disrupting the chain of transmission.
Yeah, incredibly difficult situation for those working to help those affected. We're also hearing concerns, Torun, about delayed detection, weak surveillance systems, and even aid cuts affecting the overall preparedness. Do you think the international system, to some degree, failed to act early enough here?
I think this is one of those challenges logistically because of the area as well. As I've said earlier, we have to think about the cultures and practices of where a condition or where something is being dealt with, and we need to be respectful to those practices. But also it can be those educational points, because as I say here, some of the methods of burial can also assist with spreading. When we have weak surveillance systems, that means that that viruses can run rampant. They thrive on people not being organised. It's that speed and under detection of how this is spread has really assisted. It is a contact-based virus and it's not airborne, which does limit the potential for a pandemic. But it is a challenge, and it's definitely a scary situation for those who are living in it, who are not just dealing with a public health emergency, but the very real impact of a war-torn area and conflict.
Finally, Torrent, what are the biggest risks now, and what are the priorities that the authorities are going to be and ought to be focusing on?
Geographic spread is the concern. They've already been warning, the African CDC have been warning other areas about this. So we have to think about that cross-border movement. In dense populations, that's another concern, as we heard there, about travelling, people being very close together. And when people are being displaced, that really hampers our ability to do that contact tracing, to connect the dots on who's been around the infected person. And then there's also funding gaps as well, and infrastructure, which is fragile. And we haven't even got onto the point that even if we get a vaccine there, logistically getting a vaccine to those people in that area is also going to pose a huge challenge. There's no easy one to tackle.
No easy one to tackle. Torrent, it's been great to get your expertise on this. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Okay, after the break, we'll check in with our correspondents around the globe. Do stay with us. A warm welcome back wherever you're watching Primetime. Europe is facing an unusually early heat wave with record temperatures reported across several countries, along with heat-related deaths and growing safety warnings.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where an unusually early and punishing heat wave grips the continent. On Tuesday, France recorded its hottest day in May, with temperatures peaking between 30 and 35 degrees Celsius. French Junior Energy Minister Maud Brejon said at least 7 people died from causes potentially linked to the extreme heat, including 5 drowning deaths in lakes, rivers, or at beaches, and 2 fatalities during sporting competitions. France's Atlantic coast is well known for its beaches and strong riptides. The unusually early heat wave created added danger by arriving before the summer beach season, when lifeguards are typically on duty, raising serious safety concerns for swimmers. Paris and other regions remain on high alert, with officials urging people to stay indoors, hydrate, and avoid strenuous activity. But this is far from a French problem. Record temperatures were recorded here in the Netherlands, with Eindhoven hitting 31 degrees. In Britain, temperatures also hit record levels, with parts of London and southeast England sweltering in heat more typical of midsummer. Authorities in the UK say at least 4 teenagers died in apparent drownings in lakes and reservoirs, while a 60-year-old man died in the sea off southwest England. Spain is also baking, with temperatures climbing well above seasonal norms, particularly in the south, while Italy issued heat warnings in several cities as health authorities monitor vulnerable populations, including the elderly and outdoor workers. Scientists have long warned that climate change is making heat waves more frequent, more intense, and arriving earlier in the year. And that's the concern here. It's May, not August. It may be a long and dangerous season ahead, with mounting pressure on health systems, infrastructure, and workers exposed to heat. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Turkey is intensifying diplomatic contacts over rising regional tensions, with President Erdogan holding talks with the leaders of Iran and Pakistan amid renewed focus on US-Iran negotiations and Middle East stability. Here are the details.
Turkey is maintaining a high level of diplomatic engagement. as regional tensions continue to simmer around Iran and the broader Middle East. According to the Turkish Communications Directorate, President Erdogan held separate phone calls on Tuesday with Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. During his call with Pezeshkian, Erdogan reportedly said Ankara would continue supporting indirect talks between Iran and the United States, with the aim of achieving what he described as positive results. He also said that the ongoing regional conflict had cast a shadow over the Muslim Eid al-Adha holiday, which began on Tuesday, while also voicing hope that the Iranian people would overcome the difficult circumstances currently facing the country. In his phone call with Pakistan's Prime Minister, Erdogan stressed the importance of close Turkey-Pakistan relations, highlighting the mediating roles played by both countries. Tuesday's phone calls were part of a broader diplomatic push by Ankara in recent days. Over the weekend, Erdogan spoke with several regional leaders, as well as U.S. President Donald Trump, amid renewed speculation over a possible diplomatic breakthrough with Tehran. Those discussions came alongside increasing diplomatic activity surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical energy choke points, through which roughly a fifth of globally traded oil passes. There have also been mounting concerns in recent days about a possible resumption of U.S.-Iran hostilities, which would likely have major implications for regional stability, global energy markets, and international shipping routes. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Well, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian and Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev have held a phone call ahead of Eid al-Adha, pledging to strengthen ties and regional cooperation. Our correspondent Toraz Shirililo has more.
The president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, and the Azerbaijani president, Ilham Aliyev, held a phone call on Tuesday on the advent of Eid al-Adha, during which they vowed to develop the mutual cooperation between their neighboring countries for expansion of regional prosperity and security. According to the Iranian president's office, the two leaders reaffirmed their commitment to constructive cooperation aimed at achieving regional stability, prosperity, and sustainable development. President Pezeshkian expressed his gratitude for Azerbaijan's constructive stance and support during the Israel-US war with Iran, stressing that regional interactions are key to securing long-term peace and security. He also congratulated President Aliyev on the occasion of Azerbaijan's Independence Day on 28th of May. The office of Iranian president added that Azerbaijan's president wished peace and prosperity for the Iranian nation and voiced his country's strong support for an end to regional conflicts. The two presidents further exchanged views on bilateral cooperation in macroeconomic sectors, transit, and people-to-people exchanges. They stressed the necessity of accelerating the implementation of existing agreements to elevate the level of mutual relations. President Pezeshkian also held phone calls with presidents of Egypt, Iraq, Kyrgyzstan, Malaysia, Tajikistan, and Turkey, Emir of Qatar, Sultan of Oman, and Prime Minister of Iraq on the occasion of Eid al-Adha, discussing with them the expansion of bilateral ties and the latest regional developments. Toraz Shirililo from Tehran for A News.
Uzbekistan is sending its first cargo shipment to Syria as both sides look to build new trade links through Aleppo. Our correspondent in Tashkent brings us more.
Uzbek companies have agreed to send the first shipment of goods to Syria using 10 cargo trucks. The agreement was reached during online negotiations organized by Chamber of Commerce and Industry with the participation of Uzbek and Syrian business representatives. According to the deal, 4 trucks could transport household appliances, another 4 will carry cooking oil products, while 2 trucks will deliver spare car parts and motor oils. The discussion also focused on logistics flows, demand for Uzbek products, and the development of trade operations through the newly opened Uzbek-Syrian Trade House in Aleppo. Last week, Uzbekistan officially launched its first trade house and distribution center in the Syrian city of Aleppo, under the Made in Uzbekistan brand. Officials estimate delivery time to Syria at around 10 days, with transportation cost averaging $2,500 per container. Earlier, Chamber of Commerce Chairman Davon Vahabov said Uzbek exports to Syria could reach between $100 and $150 million in 2026, mainly through supplies of automobiles, electrical equipment and food products. It is Sivil Rajab reported from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
Britain has sanctioned 3 Georgia-registered companies accused of helping Russia bypass restrictions after investigators link them to crypto payments and shadow financial networks. Our correspondent Nini Nikolashvili has the details.
The United Kingdom says 3 companies registered in Georgia helped Russia evade sanctions. These companies are Arvix, Rapira Group and Avery. According to British authorities and blockchain investigators, these firms were involved in Russia's shadow financial system. One of them, Rapira, was registered in Georgia in November 2022, just months after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Investigators say it handled millions of dollars in crypto transactions linked to sanctioned Russian networks. Another company, Avery, reportedly helped convert cash into cryptocurrency through operations in Moscow, Dubai and Turkey. It was also involved in payments linked to Russia-China trade outside the regular banking system. Georgia's National Bank says none of the companies were under its supervision, but it also confirmed that in September 2025 it identified the firms operating without registration and passed information to law enforcement. That was 8 months ago. Now, questions are growing in Georgia. What action was taken after the warning? Who received the information? And why did it take UK sanctions for the case to become public? The UK has sanctioned more than 3,300 people, companies and vessels linked to Russia. 3 of those companies were registered in Georgia. Nini Nikolashvili, Tbilisi, A News.
Afghanistan's economy is showing signs of growth, but the World Bank says this is not improving people's lives. Its new Afghanistan Development Update warns that falling aid, regional tensions and the return of millions of Afghans are putting more pressure on the country. Our correspondent Tamim Bahis has the details from Kabul.
Here in Kabul, the World Bank says Afghanistan's economy is experiencing moderate growth and macroeconomic stability has been relatively maintained. But the report stresses that this growth is not translating into better living standards for ordinary Afghans. According to the report, one of the main challenges is rapid population growth, driven largely by the return of millions of Afghans from neighboring countries. This has increased pressure on jobs, housing, food, and basic services. As a result, income per person is falling, meaning many families are becoming worse off despite overall economic growth. The report also warns that Afghanistan's future outlook remains fragile. Declining international aid, increasing external pressure, regional tensions, and weak trade are making the country more vulnerable. The World Bank says the economy may continue to grow, but without more jobs, higher incomes, and stronger support for basic services, many Afghans are unlikely to feel any real improvement in their daily lives. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, A News.
China's climate numbers are under fresh scrutiny after a new report suggested updated accounting methods may have sharply changed the picture on emissions growth. Now, the revised figures point to slower growth than previously thought, but experts warn this is about methodology, not necessarily a real-world fall in pollution.
A new report says China's updated method for calculating carbon emissions may have cut previously estimated emissions growth in half between 2020 and 2025. Researchers say emissions now appear to have risen by around 7% during the period instead of the earlier estimate of 14%. The report says the change is linked to revisions in China's climate accounting methods, including how fossil fuels are used and industrial emissions are measured. Analysts say that the new calculations could make comparisons with previous years more difficult and have sparked debate over emissions reporting standards. China remains the world's largest carbon emitter, Beijing has pledged to peak carbon emissions before 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2060. Experts stress that the revised figures do not necessarily mean emissions actually fell, but reflect changes in methodology. At the same time, China continues investing heavily in solar, wind, and electric vehicle production while still relying on coal for energy security and economic growth. Manu Maktoum, A News, Beijing.
After the break, we'll have more top stories. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching Primetime. An investigation has been launched into a deadly crash between a train and a school bus in Belgium. Now, this comes after authorities said the bus entered a level crossing despite the barrier already being down.
At least 4 people, including 2 children, have been killed in the Belgian town of Buggenhout after a train collided with a school minibus on Tuesday. Authorities say the bus was travelling along a road parallel to the railway when the driver turned onto a level crossing despite the barrier already being down. The collision was severe, with the train reportedly travelling at around 90 kilometres per hour. An investigation into the cause of the crash is underway. Authorities say tests on the bus driver who died in the incident were negative for drugs and alcohol.
The investigation into the circumstances and cause is currently ongoing. The train driver tested negative for alcohol and drugs. An autopsy will be carried out on the body of the bus driver to establish a clearest picture for the circumstances of the accident. Concerning the school bus driver, he never obtained any convictions in the past. We are doing everything we can to establish the exact circumstances as quickly as possible.
Drivers from the same transport company said the incident had deeply affected their colleagues.
The mood is grim among all bus drivers. It's something you don't want to experience. It will probably be an unfortunate accident, I think, with a tragic outcome. We hope that the investigation will clarify what happened.
The school bus was carrying 7 children at the time of the crash. Authorities say the remaining 5 children are in a critical but stable condition in hospital, while passengers on the train did not suffer major injuries. Belgium has seen a number of accidents at level crossings in recent years. According to Infrabel, 36 people have died in 168 such incidents since 2021.
Millions of Muslims from around the world have gathered in Saudi Arabia for the annual Hajj pilgrimage. Worshippers perform prayers at Mount Arafat before continuing sacred rituals in Mecca. Now, the pilgrimage comes at a time of heightened tensions in the Middle East.
More than 1.5 million Muslims have gathered in Mecca for the annual Hajj pilgrimage, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. In the Saudi Arabia city, pilgrims performed the tawaf, walking 7 times around the Kaaba at the Grand Mosque, as part of the sacred rituals that symbolize faith, unity, and devotion. Other rites include the symbolic stoning of the devil. Earlier, millions gathered at Mount Arafat, around 20 kilometers from Mecca, for the most important stage of the pilgrimage. Pilgrims spent hours praying, reflecting, and reciting verses from the Quran during the day of Arafah, considered the spiritual peak of Hajj. The pilgrimage brings together Muslims from across the world in a shared act of worship and humility. This year's Hajj also comes amid regional tensions, following US and Israeli attacks on Iran earlier this year.
Norway is stepping up support for Ukraine with a new €40 million package aimed at helping the country protect its energy system before winter. Now, the funding will be channeled through the European Union's Ukraine investment framework, focusing on repairs to damaged infrastructure, renewable energy projects, battery storage, and decentralized power networks. Norwegian officials say the aim is to help Ukraine withstand further disruption as Russian missile and drone attacks continue to target critical facilities. The package is also expected to support Kyiv's longer-term alignment with European energy standards as the country works to build greater resilience while the war continues. Latvia says it is strengthening anti-drone defences along its borders with Russia and Belarus following a series of incidents involving drones entering NATO airspace. Military officials say new interceptor drone teams will begin patrolling border areas within weeks as concerns grow over spillover risks from the war in Ukraine. The move comes after several Ukrainian drones reportedly veered into Baltic airspace, which Kyiv says was caused by Russian signal jamming. Latvian officials say the growing use of small military drones is creating new security challenges for NATO as countries race to adapt to rapidly evolving battlefield technology.
We need to increase this number, not only as Latvia, but as well different countries. We need to increase this teams with classical armament, with interceptor drones, with different. We need to increase, but we need to find this balance between the peacetime and wartime. Because we will, if we put the teams to, for example, to every kilometer, we will burn out soon all the resources of the armed forces, because it's thousands of the men and so on. We need to find this balance. In general, it is not technological challenge. We have all the technologies. We have the radars, acoustic systems. In general, we can buy and install. It's just like a question about the resource, how money you spend. But there is not some technologies what you need to invent. Everything already is invented and you just need to do it. But regarding to small drones, this is challenging.
Azerbaijan says the UN system must be more effective, more inclusive and more firmly anchored in international law. Well, speaking in New York, Foreign Minister Ceyhun Bayramov said justice, regional cooperation and reform should remain central to global peace efforts.
Azerbaijan's Foreign Minister Ceyhun Bayramov addressed a UN Security Council open debate on maintaining international peace and security. Held in New York under the presidency of China, the UN Security Council debate focused strengthening the UN-centered international system. In his speech, Bayramov stressed the necessity of ending impunity for violations of international law and ensuring justice. The minister stated that Azerbaijan is among the countries that have experienced the grave consequences of violations of the UN Charter and shortcomings in the implementation of international law.
Mr. President, Azerbaijan has itself experienced the devastating consequences of violations of the UN Charter and the failure in enforcing international law. Today, having emerged as a leading contributor to regional stability and reinforcing its peace agenda through tangible actions, Azerbaijan continues to advocate for a revitalized and reformed multilateral system with the United Nations at its core. Such a system also requires better utilization of regional organizations and formats that share the objective of the UN and contribute to their attainment.
The speech also highlighted the importance of reforms aimed at making the UN system more effective, inclusive and responsive. The minister emphasized the importance of regional organizations and cooperation formats operating in accordance with the goals and principles of the UN.
Azerbaijan has significantly contributed to multilateralism over the past years. This includes our result-oriented chairmanship in the non-aligned movement, our exemplary presidency and hosting of COP29 and the World Urban Forum, and our ongoing chairmanship of the Conference on Interaction and Confidence-Building Measures in Asia. To conclude, I recall that the Charter of the United Nations is built on the premise that through unity and cooperation, nations can establish a durable framework for peace, justice and the rule of law.
During the visit, Minister Bayramov also met with the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in New York. The parties exchanged views on regional peace and security, sustainable development, climate action, and ongoing efforts to strengthen the effectiveness of the UN-centered international system.
The US Secretary of State and the Armenian Foreign Minister have signed a strategic partnership agreement in Yerevan, deepening cooperation on critical minerals and regional transit. Let's take a look at this report.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Armenian Foreign Minister Ararat Mirzoyan signed a strategic partnership agreement in the Armenian capital Yerevan on Tuesday. The meeting was held at Yerevan's Zvartnots International Airport during a brief stopover by Rubio. The two sides also signed a framework agreement on critical minerals, as well as another on cooperation over a proposed 43-kilometre transit corridor across southern Armenia. The route would provide Azerbaijan with direct access to its exclave of Nakhchivan and onward to Turkey.
Today, by renewing the Strategic Partnership Charter, it's an opportunity to outline the future of the U.S.-Armenia bilateral relationship and creating a new path for partnership and economic opportunity for Armenians and for Americans. Finally, we also, on the Memorandum of Understanding on critical minerals, is also going to further enhance mutual prosperity. Countries that are able to do that are going to be able to find economic independence and are going to be able to find themselves at the center of innovation in the 21st century.
Armenian Foreign Minister Ararat Mirzoyan said the meeting created new opportunities for both sides, particularly in the fields of artificial intelligence and other strategic sectors. Rubio's visit comes as Russia has threatened to exert economic pressure on Yerevan over its growing ties with the West, including by raising the price Armenia pays for Russian gas if it moves away from integration with Moscow. Ahead of Rubio's brief visit, the Kremlin said on Monday Armenia could lose the very attractive price it currently pays for Russian gas if it distances itself from Russia. Armenia remains heavily dependent on Russia and Iran for energy supplies and would be hard hit by any increase in gas prices. Russia also banned imports of Armenian flowers, mineral water and brandy in another signal of its displeasure over Yerevan's warming ties with the West. Rubio's visit to Yerevan came less than 2 weeks before Armenia's parliamentary elections. On June 7th, Armenians will vote in an election pitting Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's Civil Contract Party against a range of opposition groups, many of them considered pro-Russian.
And finally, the race back to the moon is no longer just about planting flags. It's about building something that can last. NASA says private companies will now play a central role in creating the foundations for long-term lunar operations as Washington looks ahead to Mars and keeps one eye on China's own ambitions.
NASA has announced plans for a series of privately funded lunar missions aimed at establishing a sustainable presence on the moon. Named Moonbase, the missions will oversee preparations for astronaut surface operations. The space agency has awarded contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars to 4 US companies to deliver robotic landers, hopping drones and vehicles. Jeff Bezos' space company, Blue Origin, is among the firms selected to build the machines.
Now, Moonbase 1 will be the first privately funded lunar lander mission in history. The Blue Origin Mark 1 Endurance lander will deliver multiple payloads to the Shackleton Connecting Ridge, a strategic area of the lunar South Pole. In addition to flying 2 NASA science payloads, SCALPs, a lunar retroreflector array, the mission objective is to demonstrate critical capabilities that reduce risk for the human landing system missions.
NASA says the goal of the Moonbase is to support the development of a lunar economy while conducting scientific research and laying the groundwork for future missions to Mars.
We envision the Moonbase to be hundreds of square miles with different assets, all building up to the objective of permanent lunar presence on the moon. To get there, we're going to break it up in phases, and phase 1 has already started.
The second phase will involve the construction of semi-permanent infrastructure, while the third phase aims to establish a sustained presence through routine crew rotations and continuous surface activity. The United States hopes to return astronauts to the moon before President Donald Trump leaves office in 2029. NASA is also competing with China in the race to return humans to the lunar surface, with Beijing aiming to land astronauts on the moon by 2030.
The sky no longer the limit then when it comes to doing business in space. Well, that is all we have for you for Prime Time tonight. Please do join us again tomorrow for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here at A News, thanks for watching.